The dust kicked up by wagon wheels hung in the scorching Arizona air like a brown curtain, coating everything in the small frontier town of Copper Ridge with a fine layer of grit. Sarah McKenna pulled her threadbare shawl tighter around her shoulders, not for warmth. The September sun was merciless, but to hide the patches that marked her as one of the town's unfortunates. Her younger sister, Emma, barely 8 years old, clung to her hand with fingers that felt too thin, too fragile. "Sarah, my stomach hurts," Emma whispered, her voice barely audible above the creaking of passing wagons and the distant hammering from the blacksmith's shop. Sarah's heart clenched. It had been 2 days since they'd had a proper meal, and the few coins she'd earned washing clothes for Mrs. Henderson had gone to pay for the mouldy corner of the boarding house where they slept. Their parents had died of fever the previous winter, leaving Sarah at 19 to care for her little sister with nothing but determination and dwindling hope. She knelt down to Emma's level, brushing a strand of auburn hair from the child's dirty face. "I know, sweetheart. Just hold on a little longer, all right?" The main street bustled with afternoon activity. Cowboys led their horses to the saloon, their spurs jingling against the wooden boardwalk. Well-dressed townspeople moved between the general store and the bank, their conversations mixing with the sound of piano music drifting from the gambling hall. Sarah watched them with hollow eyes, seeing the ease in their movements, the way they didn't count every penny twice before spending it. Her gaze fixed on the market stall, where old Mr. Patterson sold fresh bread and provisions. The golden loaves sat in wicker baskets, their crusts gleaming in the sunlight. The smell of yeast and flour made her mouth water and her stomach clench with painful emptiness. "Wait here," she told Emma, positioning her sister in the shade between 2 buildings. "Don't move until I come back." Emma nodded, her blue eyes too serious for a child her age. She'd learned not to ask questions when survival was at stake. Sarah approached the market stall with measured steps, her heart pounding against her ribs. Mr. Patterson was busy haggling with a customer over the price of salt pork, his back turned to his merchandise. The moral weight of what she was about to do pressed down on her shoulders like a physical burden. But Emma's pale face and the way her dress hung loose on her small frame made the decision for her. In one swift motion, Sarah grabbed a loaf of bread and tucked it under her shawl. She turned to walk away, her legs trembling with adrenaline and shame. "Hey! Stop right there, you little thief!" "Mr." Patterson's voice cracked like a whip across the market square. Every head turned toward Sarah, and she felt the weight of dozens of judgmental stares. Her cheeks burned with humiliation as she slowly turned around, the bread still hidden beneath her shawl. "Empty your hands, girl, now." The crowd began to gather, forming a loose circle around her. She recognized the faces, shopkeepers, farmers, townspeople who had watched her family's decline with a mixture of pity and moral superiority. Among them stood Sheriff Collins, his hand resting casually on his gun belt, his weathered face stern with disapproval. "Sarah McKenna," he said, his voice carrying the authority of law and judgment. "You know better than this." Sarah's throat felt like sandpaper. She pulled the loaf from beneath her shawl and held it out, her hands shaking. "Please, Sheriff, my sister, she hasn't eaten in 2 days. I can work to pay for it, I just—" "Stealing is stealing," Mr. Patterson interrupted, his face red with indignation. "Doesn't matter the reason. You can't just take what isn't yours." The crowd murmured in agreement. Sarah felt tears burning behind her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She wouldn't give these people the satisfaction of seeing her break completely. "The jail," Sheriff Collins said quietly, "or 20 lashes. Your choice." Sarah's world tilted. Either punishment meant abandoning Emma, leaving her sister alone and hungry while Sarah paid for her desperate attempt to feed her. She opened her mouth to speak, to plead, to explain that there had to be another way. That's when the shadow fell across the market stall. From the edge of the crowd, a figure stepped forward. He moved with the fluid grace of someone accustomed to moving silently through hostile territory, his moccasined feet making no sound on the dusty ground. The crowd instinctively parted. their conversations dying to whispers and nervous glances. He was Apache. That much was clear from his dark hair braided with leather strips, his bronze skin weathered by sun and wind, and the traditional style of his clothes. But what struck Sarah most were his eyes, dark, intelligent, and filled with a depth of understanding that seemed to see straight through to her soul. The man couldn't have been much older than herself, perhaps 25, with strong shoulders and calloused hands that spoke of hard work and harder survival. He wore a mix of traditional and white man's clothing, buckskin leggings, a cotton shirt, and a leather vest decorated with small silver conchos that caught the light when he moved. The crowd's mood shifted palpably. Hands moved closer to weapons, and the easy afternoon air grew thick with tension. In Copper Ridge, as in most frontier towns, Apache presence meant trouble, or at least that's what most folks believed. Sheriff Collins stepped forward, his hand now openly resting on his gun. "You got business here, Apache?" The man didn't respond to the sheriff. Instead, he walked calmly to Mr. Patterson's stall, reaching into a small leather pouch at his belt. The crowd watched in stunned silence as he counted out silver coins, more than enough to pay for the bread, and placed them on the wooden counter with deliberate precision. "For the bread," he said, his English clear but accented with the musical cadence of his native tongue. His voice was quiet, but it carried clearly in the sudden hush. Mr. Patterson stared at the coins, as if they might bite him. Well, the girl still stole it." The Apache man turned to look at Sarah directly for the first time. His gaze was not judgmental or pitying, but simply acknowledging, as if he saw her not as a thief or a charity case, but as a human being facing impossible circumstances. In that look, Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced in months: dignity. Without a word, he turned back to the stall and began selecting items: another loaf of bread, dried meat, apples, beans, coffee. He filled a wicker basket with enough provisions to last a week, maybe more. The crowd watched in fascination and growing discomfort as he counted out more coins, overpaying by a significant margin. "This is highly irregular," Sheriff Collins muttered, but he made no move to stop the transaction. The Apache's presence was unsettling, but he was clearly conducting legitimate business. When the basket was full, the man lifted it easily and walked to where Sarah stood frozen in the center of the hostile crowd. He stopped in front of her, the basket between them like an offering. "For you and your sister," he said simply. Sarah stared at the basket, then up at his face. She had expected many things when she'd stolen that bread: punishment, jail, public humiliation. She had not expected kindness, especially not from a stranger, and certainly not from someone her people had taught her to fear. "I don't understand," she whispered. "Why?" Something that might have been a smile touched the corners of his mouth. "Sometimes," he said, his voice so quiet only she could hear, "the world tests our hearts. Today, I choose to listen to mine." He held out the basket until her trembling hands reached up to take it. The weight of it was substantial, more food than she and Emma had seen in weeks. The simple generosity of the gesture, offered without expectation or judgment, nearly broke her composure entirely. "Thank you," she managed, her voice thick with unshed tears. "I don't even know your name." "Joseph," he said. "Joseph Crow Feather." The crowd was growing restless, murmuring among themselves about the strange scene unfolding before them. Some called it charity, others viewed it with deep suspicion. In their world, interactions between white settlers and Apache rarely ended in anything but violence or mistrust. Sheriff Collins cleared his throat loudly. "Well, I suppose if the debt is paid—" "It is paid," Joseph confirmed, his dark eyes never leaving Sarah's face. "The matter is settled." The sheriff nodded reluctantly, and the crowd began to disperse, though many lingered to continue their whispered conversations about what they'd witnessed. Sarah stood clutching the basket, acutely aware that her life had just shifted in a way she couldn't yet comprehend. Joseph turned to go, but Sarah's voice stopped him. "Wait." She stepped forward, careful not to drop the precious basket. "Why did you help us? You don't know me, and your people and mine are not enemies by choice," he finished quietly. "And hunger recognizes no color of skin." He glanced toward the alley where Emma waited, hidden but undoubtedly watching. "Take care of your sister. This land is hard enough without carrying the weight of hate as well." With that he walked away, his figure soon lost among the wagons and horses that filled the busy street. Sarah stood watching until she could no longer see him, the basket heavy in her arms and heavier questions filling her mind. That evening, in the cramped corner of the boarding house that Sarah and Emma called home, the sisters shared the first real meal they'd had in days. Emma's eyes grew wide as Sarah unpacked the basket, revealing treasures that seemed almost magical in their abundance. Fresh bread that still held warmth from the baker's oven, strips of dried venison seasoned with herbs she couldn't identify, apples so red and perfect they seemed to glow in the lamplight. "Is this really all for us?" Emma asked, her small hands hovering over an apple, as if afraid it might disappear. "Yes, sweetheart. All of it." Sarah cut the bread carefully, savoring the way the crust cracked beneath the knife. The simple act of sharing food felt like a celebration after so many days of emptiness. As they ate, Sarah found herself thinking about Joseph Crow Feather, his quiet dignity, the way he'd paid for bread he could have easily walked away from purchasing. Most confusing of all was the absence of any expectation in his gesture. He hadn't asked for thanks, hadn't made a show of his generosity, hadn't even stayed long enough to see how his gift was received. "Sarah?" Emma's voice was small, uncertain. Was that man really Apache? Sarah paused in her eating. In the frontier towns of Arizona Territory, Apache was often spoken like a curse word, associated with raids, violence, and fear. Children grew up hearing stories that painted them as bloodthirsty savages, barely human. Yet Joseph's actions had been more human, more Christian, than most of the white townspeople who claimed moral superiority. Yes, Emma, he was Apache, but he was kind to us. Yes, he was very kind. Emma digested this information along with her bread. "Mrs. Patterson says Apache people are bad, that they steal children and burn houses." Sarah looked at her sister's serious face, seeing the confusion there. How do you explain to a child that the world is more complicated than the stories adults tell? That people can't be painted with a single brush? That kindness and cruelty exist in every community? "Mrs. Patterson has probably never actually talked to an Apache person," Sarah said carefully. "People sometimes fear what they don't understand. But what we know is that when we needed help today, it was Joseph who stepped forward." 3 days later, Sarah was drawing water from the well behind the boarding house when she heard familiar voices approaching. She recognized the sharp tone of Mrs. Patterson and the deeper grumble of her husband discussing the incident at the market. "Completely improper," Mrs. Patterson was saying. "That Apache has been seen around town several times since then, watching, lurking." "Maybe we should tell the sheriff," Mr. Patterson replied. "Can't have savages thinking they can just wander through town whenever they please." Sarah's hands tightened on the well rope. Without fully understanding why, she felt a surge of protective anger. Joseph had done nothing but show kindness, yet here were the very people who had watched her humiliation without offering help, now condemning the one person who had acted with decency. "He has every right to be in town," Sarah found herself saying, stepping into view with her water bucket. "He's done nothing wrong." Mrs. Patterson's face flushed red. "Sarah McKenna, you have no business defending that Indian. Have you forgotten your place?" "My place." Sarah set down the bucket, her patience finally fraying. "My place is looking after my sister. And when she was hungry, it wasn't you who helped. It wasn't anyone from this town who showed Christian charity. It was Joseph." "Christian charity?" Mr. Patterson sputtered. "Heathens don't practice." "He fed us when you would have seen me jailed," Sarah interrupted, her voice rising. He paid for what I took, then gave us more than we could have asked for. If that's not Christian, then I don't know what is." Mrs. Patterson drew herself up to her full height, her face a mask of moral indignation. "Mark my words, girl, no good will come of this association. Those people are violent by nature. You'll learn soon enough." After they left, Sarah remained by the well, her hands shaking slightly from the confrontation. She had surprised herself with her vehemence, but she couldn't bring herself to regret defending Joseph. In a world that had shown her little kindness, his gesture had been a light in the darkness. The next morning, she found him waiting by the general store, examining a saddle with the careful attention of someone who understood good craftsmanship. He looked up as she approached, and she saw something in his expression that might have been relief. "Sarah," he said, nodding slightly, "I hoped I might see you again." "Why?" The question came out more bluntly than she intended. He smiled, the first full smile she'd seen from him. It transformed his face, making him look younger, less burdened. "Because I wanted to make sure you and your sister were well, and because—" He hesitated, as if weighing his words carefully. "Because I enjoy talking with someone who sees people as they are, not as others say they should be." Sarah felt heat rise in her cheeks. "I defended you. To the Pattersons. They were saying cruel things. You didn't need to do that." "Yes, I did." She looked directly into his dark eyes. It was the right thing to do. For a long moment they stood in comfortable silence, the morning bustle of the town flowing around them. Sarah was acutely aware of the glances they were receiving, some curious, others disapproving. But for the first time in months, she didn't care what others thought. "Would you like to see something?" Joseph asked suddenly. "Something beautiful? You and Emma." Sarah hesitated. Accepting his help with food was one thing, a moment of desperation that could be explained, if not justified. But deliberately spending time with him, allowing Emma to develop a friendship that crossed lines the town wouldn't forgive. As if reading her thoughts, Joseph added quietly, "There is a place not far from town, where the old oak grows beside the stream, very peaceful, very safe. I often go there when the world feels too heavy." Sarah thought of Emma, cooped up in their tiny room, growing thinner and sadder each day. When was the last time her sister had played, had laughed, had simply been a child? "Yes," she said before she could change her mind, "we'd like that very much." The place Joseph led them to was indeed beautiful. About a mile outside Copper Ridge, where the land began to rise toward distant mountains, an ancient oak tree spread its massive branches over a clear running stream. Wildflowers dotted the grass, and the air hummed with the lazy sound of bees and the gentle splash of water over stones. Emma's transformation was immediate and heartwarming. The moment she saw the stream, she clapped her hands and ran to the water's edge, her previous shyness forgotten. For the first time in weeks, she looked like the 8-year-old child she was supposed to be. "Can I put my feet in?" she asked, turning to Joseph, with the unconscious trust children show to adults who treat them with kindness. "Of course," he replied, settling onto a fallen log that made a natural bench. "The water is very clean here, good for drinking, good for cooling tired feet." Sarah watched her sister splash happily in the shallow water and felt some of the constant tension in her shoulders begin to ease. This was what Emma needed: space to breathe, to play, to simply exist without the weight of adult worries pressing down on her. "You know this place well," Sarah observed, settling onto the log beside Joseph, careful to maintain a respectful distance. "I come here often. When I was younger, my grandfather would bring me to this stream to teach me about patience." He gestured toward the water. He would say, "Watch how the stream moves around the stones, never fighting them, but never stopping. This is how we must live among those who do not understand us." Sarah turned to study his profile. "Your grandfather was wise." "He was. He died 2 winters ago, but his words," Joseph touched his chest lightly, "they live here still. Is your family nearby?" The question was perhaps too personal, but Sarah found herself genuinely curious about this man who had stepped into her life like an unexpected gift. Joseph's expression grew more guarded. My people move with the seasons. Some are north, near the reservation boundaries. Others, he shrugged, others choose their own paths. I've been working for a rancher, Tom Morrison, about 10 miles south of here. Good man, fair wages. Sarah knew the Morrison Ranch by reputation, one of the larger operations in the territory, known for treating both cattle and employees decently. It made sense that Joseph would find work there, but it also explained his presence in Copper Ridge. He wasn't a wandering threat, as some townspeople imagined, but a working man earning an honest living. Emma, Joseph called to the girl, who was now attempting to catch minnows with her bare hands. Would you like to learn to make a whistle from a reed? Emma's eyes lit up. Yes, please. Joseph waded into the stream and selected a straight reed, then patiently showed Emma how to cut it and create holes that would produce different sounds. Sarah watched this interaction with wonder. When was the last time an adult had taken such interest in Emma's happiness? When had anyone shown her sister the kind of gentle attention that said she mattered, that her joy was important? As the afternoon progressed, Sarah found herself relaxing completely for the first time in months. Joseph proved to be an excellent teacher, showing Emma how to identify different birds by their calls, how to read the weather in the movement of clouds, how to find the sweetest wild berries. More importantly, he listened to her chatter with genuine interest, asking questions that made her feel important and heard. Sarah, Emma called from where she was decorating the oak tree's trunk with small stones she'd collected. Can we come back tomorrow? Before Sarah could answer, Joseph spoke quietly. Your sister is welcome here any time. You both are. This place belongs to no one and everyone. Sarah felt a familiar stab of anxiety. People in town are already talking. If they knew we were spending time together, are you ashamed to be here? The question was gentle, but she heard the underlying vulnerability in it. No. The answer came immediately, surprising her with its certainty. No, I'm not ashamed. I'm grateful. Emma is happier than she's been in months, and She struggled to find words for the peace she felt in this place, with this man who asked nothing of her except to be herself. I feel like I can breathe again. Joseph nodded slowly. Then we will be careful, but we will not hide. There is no shame in friendship, Sarah. There is no shame in kindness. Over the following weeks, they developed a routine. Sarah would finish her washing work in the early afternoon, collect Emma from where she spent mornings helping Mrs. Chen at the Chinese laundry, and they would walk to the oak tree. Joseph would usually arrive shortly after, often bringing small gifts. Smooth stones for Emma to collect, wild honey wrapped in bark, occasionally a carved wooden toy that he'd made during the long evening hours. Emma blossomed under this attention. She learned to swim in the deeper parts of the stream, to identify different types of plants, to move quietly through the woods without disturbing the wildlife. More importantly, she laughed again. She played. She began to look forward to each day instead of simply enduring it. For Sarah, these afternoons became the anchor that held her world steady. Joseph was unlike any man she'd ever known. Patient where others were demanding, thoughtful where others were impulsive, respectful where others felt entitled to make claims on her time and attention. He never pressed her for more than she was comfortable giving, never made her feel like his kindness came with strings attached. One evening, as they sat watching Emma practice the bird calls Joseph had taught her, Sarah found the courage to ask the question that had been growing in her mind. Joseph, what do you want from this? From us, I mean. He was quiet for so long she wondered if he would answer at all. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of careful honesty. I want to know that somewhere in this hard world there are people who see me as Joseph, not as the Apache. I want to know that kindness isn't wasted, that when we choose to trust instead of fear, good things can grow. He glanced at her, then at Emma, who was now attempting to teach a patient squirrel to respond to her whistle. And I want to see that little girl laugh every day for the rest of her life. Sarah felt something in her chest expand, warm and bright. "And what about me?" "You, Sarah McKenna," he said, turning to face her fully. "I want to know better. I want to understand what makes you strong enough to sacrifice your own safety for your sister. What makes you brave enough to defend a stranger against your own people. I want to learn from your courage." The honesty in his words, the way he spoke as if her friendship was something precious, made Sarah realize how much her world had changed since that day in the market. She was no longer the desperate woman who had stolen bread out of hopelessness. She was someone worthy of respect, someone whose friendship was valued, someone who could choose her own path regardless of what others expected. "I think," she said carefully, "I'd like that very much." More, as the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink, Sarah understood that she had found something she hadn't even known she was looking for. Not just help in a moment of crisis, but a different way of being in the world. A way that chose kindness over fear, understanding over judgment, and hope over despair. Emma ran up to them, her face flushed with happiness and exertion. "Sarah, can we have dinner here tonight, under the stars?" Sarah looked at Joseph, who smiled and nodded. "I think that sounds perfect, Emma." "Don't," as they shared the simple meal Joseph had brought, sitting beneath the vast Arizona sky, with Emma chattering about her adventures and plans for tomorrow. Sarah realized that this was what home felt like. Not a place, but the people who chose to see the best in you, who stood by you when the world seemed dark, who reminded you that kindness and courage were always choices worth making. The road ahead was still uncertain. The town's disapproval would likely continue, and there would be challenges she couldn't yet imagine. But for the first time since her parents' death, Sarah felt truly hopeful about the future. She had learned that sometimes the greatest gifts come from the most unexpected sources, and that when you open your heart to trust, the world has a way of responding with grace. In the distance, a nighthawk called across the desert, its voice carrying a message of endurance and hope into the starlit darkness. Sarah smiled and took her sister's hand in one of hers, and Joseph's calloused palm in the other, feeling the strength that came from choosing love over fear, understanding over hatred, and hope over despair. The world was still hard, still unforgiving in many ways. But here, under this endless sky, with these people who had chosen to see her as worthy of kindness, Sarah knew that she and Emma would not only survive, they would thrive.